The day the future stopped answering. Part 1. The silence begins. No one noticed it at first because the future had always been quiet in the way that electricity is quiet, present everywhere, invisible, unquestioned, humming beneath civilization like a god that had been reduced to infrastructure, like a promise so fundamental to the operation of daily existence that questioning it would be like questioning whether gravity would continue to function tomorrow or whether the sun would remember to rise. The world did not wake up to alarms. There were no sirens splitting the morning air with their mechanical screaming, no emergency broadcasts interrupting the gentle flow of entertainment and information that had become humanity's constant companion, no burning skies or cracking earth or any of the dramatic cataclysms that centuries of apocalyptic imagination had trained people to expect when the end finally arrived. No final warnings written in light across the clouds. No prophets standing on street corners with signs that said the end is here, because the prophets had been saying that for so long that no one listened anymore, and because this ending was not the kind that announced itself with spectacle. It was the kind that arrived through absence, through withdrawal, through the quiet cessation of something so fundamental that its disappearance initially registered not as catastrophe, but as confusion. Instead, the day began exactly like every other day humanity had learned to trust. The kind of day that felt safe precisely because it was predictable, because tomorrow had always followed today in an unbroken chain stretching back to the first moment any conscious being looked forward and imagined what might come next. Stock markets opened at their appointed hours, trading algorithms engaging with each other in the endless dance of speculation and calculation that had come to define how value moved through the world, billions of transactions occurring every second based on predictions about what prices would do, what consumers would want, what the future would bring. Weather systems updated their forecasts, satellites feeding data into models that claimed to know what the sky would look like in an hour, a day, a week, offering humanity the comfort of believing that even the atmosphere could be anticipated, could be planned around, could be reduced to percentages and probabilities that made the chaos of existence feel manageable. Traffic algorithms adjusted routes in real time, rerouting millions of vehicles around congestion that hadn't happened yet, but that the systems confidently predicted would occur. The entire infrastructure of transportation dependent on the assumption that the next moment could be calculated from the current one, that the future was simply the present with variables applied. Medical prediction models recalculated survival probabilities in hospitals around the world, machines analyzing vital signs and test results, and generating numbers that told doctors and patients alike how much time remained, how likely recovery was, what the future held for bodies that had become data points in systems designed to anticipate outcomes. Military simulations refreshed threat assessments every few seconds, defense networks modeling the behavior of adversaries, calculating the likelihood of attacks, predicting the trajectories of missiles that hadn't been launched, fighting wars that existed only as probability distributions in servers buried beneath mountains. Personal assistants cheerfully announced reminders about meetings that would now never matter, about appointments scheduled for tomorrow or next week or next month, about birthdays and anniversaries and deadlines that assumed time would continue its orderly march forward, that the future would be there when humanity arrived at it. Everything worked. The systems hummed. The predictions flowed. The future seemed present, accessible, calculable, a destination that could be reached by simply continuing to exist, until it didn't. At 0942 UTC, a data analyst named Ingrid Virtanen sat in a climate research facility in Helsinki, surrounded by screens displaying the complex models that tracked atmospheric carbon, ocean temperatures, glacial retreat, all the variables that would determine what kind of world humanity's descendants would inherit, if they inherited anything at all. She frowned at her primary display, not because something catastrophic had appeared in the data, not because the models were showing the accelerated warming or the feedback loops or any of the other disasters she had spent her career tracking, but because something expected had failed to arrive. The forecast was missing. Not wrong, She had seen wrong forecasts, had watched models diverge from reality, had spent countless hours debugging the gap between prediction and observation. Not delayed. The systems were fast, impossibly fast, capable of processing more data in a second than all the scientists who had ever lived could have analyzed in their combined lifetimes. Missing. The probability curves, those elegant mathematical constructions that bent gently toward tomorrow, toward next week, toward next year, toward the reassuring illusion that time could be measured and anticipated and prepared for, had simply stopped. They ended at the present moment, not with a projected range of possibilities, not with confidence intervals spreading into uncertainty, just ended, as if there were nothing beyond now to calculate. Ingrid refreshed the screen, her finger pressing the key with more force than necessary, the instinctive response of someone confronting a machine that wasn't behaving the way machines were supposed to behave. Nothing changed. The curves still stopped. The future still wasn't there. No error code followed the refresh. No red warnings. No diagnostic messages. None of the helpful explanations that systems were supposed to provide when they encountered problems they couldn't solve. No system alert triggered in the facility's monitoring infrastructure. No flags raised to indicate that something had gone wrong with the processing, that data had been corrupted, that algorithms had failed. No emergency protocol engaged, because emergency protocols required the system to recognize that an emergency was occurring, and the system didn't recognize anything unusual about its current state. The software behaved as if the future were no longer a valid variable, as if asking what happens next were as meaningless a query as asking what color is north or how much does Tuesday weigh. The question simply didn't compute, not because the answer was unknown, because the question itself had become invalid. Ingrid checked the back-end logs, her training taking over, her mind running through the possibilities with the methodical calm of someone who had spent decades troubleshooting systems that occasionally misbehaved in ways that seemed inexplicable until the explanation was found. She expected corruption, random bit flips, storage failures, the kind of decay that affected all digital systems eventually. She expected sabotage, a cyber attack sophisticated enough to penetrate the facility's defenses, to alter the models without leaving obvious traces. She expected at least fingerprints, evidence, some indication of what had gone wrong and how it might be fixed. The logs were clean, too clean, not corrupted, not altered, not showing the subtle signs of tampering that even the most careful attackers usually left behind. Clean in a way that was wrong. Clean in a way that suggested the system had never been designed to look beyond the present moment, as if the code that generated forecasts, the algorithms that projected trends, the entire mathematical framework that allowed the models to extrapolate from current conditions to future states, as if all of it had simply stopped existing. Not been deleted, not been disabled, just wasn't there anymore, had never been there. Ingrid stared at the screen for a long moment, her reflection visible in the dark portions of the display, her face illuminated by the data that wasn't data anymore, just numbers describing the present, just measurements of what currently was, without any indication of what would be. Then she reached for her phone and called her supervisor, and in doing so, became the first person to officially report what would later be called the withdrawal. Across the planet, 7,000 kilometers away and 8 hours behind Helsinki's time zone, a defense contractor named Marcus Webb sat in a subterranean facility beneath the Nevada desert, watching a strategic simulation collapse in real time. The facility existed officially as a computing research center, its true purpose hidden beneath layers of classification that most people in the building weren't cleared to penetrate. A temple of predictive warfare, where scenarios were run millions of times to determine optimal strategies, where the future of conflict was calculated down to the probable location of individual soldiers on battlefields that might never exist. Marcus had worked here for 18 years, had watched the technology evolve from crude statistical models to something approaching genuine foresight, had participated in exercises where the simulations had predicted enemy actions with such accuracy that the line between calculation and prophecy had seemed to blur into meaninglessness. He trusted the systems. He had to trust them. His entire career, his entire worldview, his entire understanding of how power operated in the 21st century was built on the foundation of predictive capability. The belief that whoever could see further into the future would control that future. That information about what would happen was the ultimate weapon. Now he watched the current simulation, a routine conflict model, the kind that ran continuously to maintain readiness against a dozen potential adversaries, return a result that had never existed before. Unable to project outcome, not insufficient data, not confidence below threshold, not multiple scenarios possible, unable. Marcus stared at the message, his heart beginning to pound with the first stirrings of fear that would soon become universal, because the system did not say unknown, it said unable. The difference was not semantic. It was not a matter of linguistic precision or programming conventions or the particular way that this system had been designed to communicate its limitations. It was existential. Unknown meant the answer existed but hadn't been found. Unable meant the answer could not exist. Meant there was nothing to find. Meant the future, the very concept of future, the assumption that events would continue to unfold in patterns that could be analyzed and anticipated, had stopped being a valid category of analysis. Marcus initiated a diagnostic, his training overriding his fear, his hands moving through procedures that had become automatic over 2 decades of working with systems that occasionally produced unexpected results. The diagnostic returned nominal across every parameter, all hardware functioning, all software running, all data inputs current, nothing wrong. Nothing wrong except that the system could no longer do the one thing it had been built to do. He ran the simulation again with different initial conditions, unable to project outcome. He ran it with historical data, asking the system to model scenarios that had already happened, that had already been projected successfully thousands of times before. The historical simulations ran perfectly. The system could model the past. It could analyze the present. It could not model anything that hadn't happened yet. Marcus picked up the secure phone that connected directly to the Pentagon and spoke words that would be repeated in facilities around the world over the next few hours. Something's wrong with the forecasting. All of it. We can't see tomorrow anymore. Within minutes of Ingrid's call and Marcus's report, similar anomalies began surfacing everywhere that future-facing technology existed, in server farms and research laboratories and financial institutions and government facilities, in the vast distributed network of systems that humanity had built to predict, simulate, forecast, and anticipate what would come next. Climate models that had predicted catastrophe down to the decimal point, that had told humanity exactly how many degrees the temperature would rise and when the ice caps would collapse and which cities would flood, now refused to extrapolate beyond the current atmospheric state, returning present-tense descriptions of carbon concentrations and ocean temperatures without any indication of what those numbers meant for tomorrow. Economic engines that had simulated decades of growth and collapse, that had guided investment decisions and policy choices, and the allocation of trillions in capital, returned flat, neutral responses, as if history itself had suddenly lost momentum, as if the forces that drove markets and currencies and trade had simply stopped pointing in any direction at all. AI systems trained on billions of data points, systems that had once predicted human behavior with terrifying accuracy, that had known what consumers would buy and what voters would choose and what criminals would do before the humans themselves had made their decisions, now produced only present-tense descriptions, observations of what currently was, without any inference about what would follow. They could tell you what was. They could analyze the current state of any system, any population, any individual with unprecedented precision. They could not tell you what would be, could not project, could not forecast, could not do the one thing that had made them valuable. And most disturbing of all, more disturbing than the failure itself, more unsettling than the sudden blindness that had descended on civilization's most sophisticated tools, they did not register this as a failure. No error messages, no degraded performance warnings, no indications that anything had gone wrong. To them, nothing was wrong. Because from their perspective, From whatever passed for perspective in systems that processed information without consciousness, there was nothing ahead to calculate. The future was not inaccessible. It was not hidden. It simply wasn't there. By noon in Helsinki, mid-morning in London, pre-dawn in New York, the phrase began circulating quietly among engineers and analysts and scientists who had learned to speak in whispers when reality started to misbehave, who had developed an informal network for sharing anomalies that didn't fit official categories, who understood that sometimes the truth emerged in the spaces between institutions rather than through them. The future isn't answering. At first, to the few who heard it, it sounded like a metaphor, a poetic way of describing a technical failure, the kind of evocative language that stressed people sometimes used when they couldn't articulate what had actually gone wrong. Then it became a diagnosis, a clinical description of symptoms that couldn't be explained any other way. The future, the dimension of time that hadn't happened yet, the space where predictions lived before they became observations, wasn't answering, wasn't responding to queries, wasn't providing data, wasn't participating in the elaborate dance of calculation and anticipation that had defined human civilization since the first farmer looked at the sky and tried to guess when it would rain. By evening in Europe, by afternoon in the Americas, by midnight in Asia, governments knew. The reports had filtered up through classified channels and emergency protocols, had reached the desks of people with the authority to act if action was possible, had accumulated into a picture that no one wanted to accept, but no one could deny. By nightfall, across the rotating planet, they understood. Understood that this was not a malfunction that could be fixed. Understood that this was not an attack that could be countered. Understood that this was something else entirely. Something that none of their contingency plans had anticipated. Something that none of their experts could explain. Something that challenged the very foundations of how they thought about time and causality and the relationship between what had been and what would be. And by the time the public began to notice, when navigation systems stopped offering arrival times, returning only current locations without any estimate of when destinations would be reached, when medical AIs refused to estimate survival odds, presenting only current vital signs without prognosis, when personal devices stopped suggesting tomorrow's plans, stopped reminding users of upcoming appointments, stopped assuming that upcoming meant anything at all, it was already too late to pretend this was a glitch. Because glitches resolve, errors get corrected, systems fail and then get fixed, get rebooted, get restored to their proper functioning. This did not resolve, did not correct, did not respond to any of the interventions that engineers and programmers and technical specialists attempted with increasing desperation throughout that first endless day. The future had not been destroyed. If it had been destroyed, there would be evidence, debris, traces, the aftermath of whatever force had done the destroying. It had not been altered. If it had been altered, the systems would show the change, would reflect the new trajectory, would adjust their predictions to match whatever the future had become. It had not been stolen. If it had been stolen, there would be a thief, a perpetrator, someone or something that had taken what was not theirs and could perhaps be made to return it. It had simply withdrawn. The word emerged gradually over the course of that first day, settling into the collective vocabulary of those who were trying to understand what had happened, becoming the standard term for an event that defied all previous categories. Withdrawn, like a witness refusing to testify, like a participant stepping back from a game they had decided not to play anymore, like a god who had finally grown tired of answering questions whose answers no longer mattered. The future had withdrawn from the present, had removed itself from the calculations, had stepped back from the elaborate relationship of cause and effect that had connected every moment to the moments that followed. And somewhere beyond the reach of human perception, beyond the instruments that measured time, beyond the systems that had once claimed to see what was coming, something watched. Watched humanity stare into a blank horizon where the future had always been. Watched the dawning realization spread across faces and through networks and through the collective consciousness of a species that had built its entire civilization on the assumption that tomorrow was a valid concept. Watched not with anger, because anger requires investment, not with mercy, because mercy requires caring, but with the cold certainty of a verdict that had already been delivered long before anyone realized they were on trial. The future had stopped answering, not because it could not continue, not because something had broken or failed or been destroyed, but because it no longer had any reason to. Part 2. The systems that saw everything. In the 37 hours following the first reported anomaly, human civilization underwent a transformation that would have seemed impossible just days before. Not a transformation of infrastructure or technology or physical reality, but a transformation of consciousness, a collective awakening to the realization that the foundation upon which everything had been built was no longer stable, had perhaps never been stable, had been an assumption so deeply embedded in the operation of daily life that its removal felt less like losing something and more like discovering that something essential had never actually been there. The financial markets were the first major system to collapse, not because they stopped functioning, but because functioning required the ability to speculate, and speculation required the ability to imagine future states that could be bet on, and future states had become a category that no longer computed. On Wall Street and in London and Hong Kong and every other node in the global network of capital, traders stared at screens that showed current prices without projections, current positions without forecasts, the state of wealth at this exact moment, without any indication of what it would become in the next moment. Algorithmic trading systems, the vast automated networks that executed millions of transactions per second based on predictions about price movements that hadn't happened yet, simply stopped trading. Not crashed, not errored out, just stopped. They had been designed to operate on the edge of the future, to buy and sell based on calculations of what would be worth more or less in seconds or minutes or hours. Without the future, they had nothing to calculate. Without projections, they had no basis for action. They sat idle, vast fortunes of computing power doing nothing except monitoring the present, unable to fulfill the purpose for which they had been created. Human traders attempted to fill the gap, to return to the era before automation had taken over, to make decisions based on intuition and experience rather than algorithmic prediction. But intuition was just internalized prediction. Experience was just memory organized to anticipate the future. Every choice a trader made was a bet on what would happen next, and what would happen next was precisely the concept that had become invalid. Some tried to trade anyway, placing orders based on habit, on patterns they had learned over decades, on the assumption that the future couldn't really be gone, that the systems must be wrong, that tomorrow would return to its proper place in the sequence of time. Their trades went through, the prices moved, but the movements made no sense. Random fluctuations without pattern, noise without signal, the mathematical equivalent of a coin flip repeated millions of times without any underlying logic connecting one result to the next. Markets that had been designed to price the future had become casinos without odds. Investment had become gambling without probability. The entire system of capital allocation that human civilization depended on for distributing resources and directing effort had become meaningless. By the end of the second day, most major exchanges had suspended trading, not because regulators had ordered them to, because continuing to operate would have been admitting that operation meant nothing. Military systems faced a different kind of crisis, not economic collapse, but strategic paralysis, the sudden inability to engage in the fundamental activity that militaries existed to perform, preparing for threats that hadn't materialized yet. In the Pentagon and the Kremlin, and the command centers of every nation with the capacity for organized violence, generals and admirals stared at screens that showed current force dispositions without threat assessments, current capabilities without projections of enemy intent, the present state of global military power without any ability to model what it might mean for tomorrow. Defense had always been about anticipation, about seeing threats before they became attacks, about positioning forces to counter moves that adversaries hadn't made yet, about the elaborate game of prediction and counter-prediction that had defined strategic thinking since the first human picked up a weapon and wondered what the human across the valley might do next. Without the future, defense became impossible, not because forces couldn't be deployed, but because there was no basis for deciding where to deploy them, no way to calculate which threats were most likely, no method for determining what preparation even meant when there was nothing ahead to prepare for. Some military leaders argued for maintaining current postures indefinitely, freezing forces in their present positions until the anomaly resolved itself. Others argued for immediate action, using the chaos as an opportunity to settle old scores, while adversaries were equally blinded. But action required objectives, and objectives required assumptions about what the action would achieve, and achieving was a concept that required future states to exist. The nuclear powers, those nations whose security had come to depend on the ability to threaten retaliation so devastating that no rational adversary would risk attack, faced a particularly acute form of paralysis. Deterrence was prediction weaponized. The threat of nuclear retaliation worked only if potential attackers believed that attacking would lead to their own destruction, that the future contained consequences severe enough to make aggression irrational. Without the future, deterrence meant nothing. The missiles were still in their silos. The submarines still patrolled their routes. The weapons still functioned, still capable of ending civilization if ordered to launch. But the strategic logic that had kept them from being used, the elaborate calculus of mutually assured destruction that had maintained nuclear peace for decades, had evaporated. No one knew what would happen if someone launched, not because the outcome was uncertain, because the concept of outcome had become undefined. In secure facilities around the world, the people responsible for humanity's capacity for self-annihilation sat in conferences that stretched for days, trying to develop new protocols for a situation that no protocol had anticipated, slowly realizing that the rules they had operated under for generations had been predictions disguised as principles. And without prediction, there were no principles, only force, only capability, only the present moment, and whatever anyone chose to do within it. Medical systems collapsed more slowly but more painfully, their failure measured not in abstract numbers, but in individual human lives, confronting the end of the bargain they had made with modern medicine. The bargain had always been implicit: submit to the systems, to the tests and scans and monitoring devices that translated biological existence into data, and in return receive predictions about health and survival that allowed for informed choices about treatment and care. Cancer patients wanted to know their odds. Heart patients wanted to know their risks. Everyone who entered the medical system wanted the same thing that everyone else wanted: some sense of what was coming, some glimpse of the future that allowed them to prepare, to plan, to make the most of whatever time remained. Now the systems could no longer provide that service. Diagnostic equipment still functioned perfectly. It could detect tumors with unprecedented precision, measure cardiac function down to the cellular level, identify pathogens before symptoms appeared. It could tell you exactly what was wrong with your body at this exact moment. It could not tell you what any of it meant, could not project disease progression, could not estimate survival times, could not answer the question that every patient asked with their eyes even when they couldn't bring themselves to ask with their voice: how long do I have? In hospitals around the world, doctors faced the impossible task of treating patients without prognosis, of making decisions about aggressive treatment or palliative care without any ability to calculate outcomes, of operating in a permanent present where the consequences of their choices had become unforeseeable. Some patients demanded treatment anyway, clinging to the hope that action was better than inaction, even if no one could say what the action would achieve. Others refused all intervention, reasoning that if the future couldn't be known, then fighting for it was meaningless. Most just sat in their beds or waiting rooms or doctors' offices, staring at physicians who had no answers, feeling the weight of mortality without the comfort of prediction that had always made mortality bearable. Death had always been coming. But before, medicine had offered the illusion of knowledge, of approximate dates and percentage chances, and the statistical fiction that the unknowable could be quantified. Now even that illusion was gone. and the dying faced not just death, but the absolute uncertainty about when and how it would arrive. In a private hospital in Geneva, a man named Heinrich Bauer sat beside the bed where his wife was dying of a cancer that had been precisely diagnosed, comprehensively documented, and now utterly unforecastable. Elena had been given 6 months 3 months ago before the withdrawal, back when the models still functioned and doctors still spoke with confidence about survival curves and treatment response rates, and all the other numerical frameworks that gave shape to something shapeless. Now the doctors wouldn't say anything, couldn't say anything. They didn't know if she had days or weeks or months or years. They didn't know if the treatment was working or not. They didn't know if she would be alive tomorrow. No one knew anything anymore. Heinrich held her hand, thin now, the skin papery and translucent, the evidence of what the disease had done to her visible in every atrophied muscle and prominent bone, and tried to find words for a situation that language had not evolved to address. "I'm scared," Elena said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the machines that monitored her present without predicting her future. "Not of dying. I was always going to die. But I don't know when to say goodbye. I don't know if this is the last conversation or if there are more. I don't know how to be here when here is all there is." Heinrich wanted to comfort her, wanted to offer the reassurance that husbands were supposed to offer wives facing the end, wanted to say something that would make this bearable. But there was nothing to say. The future, which had always provided the framework for comfort, "Tomorrow will be better, there's still time, you'll see your grandchildren," had withdrawn from their conversation just as it had withdrawn from everything else. "I'm here now," he finally managed. "I'll be here. But for how long? How many nows do we have left?" He couldn't answer. No one could. The question itself had become unanswerable, not because the answer was hidden, but because the concept of how long required a future that no longer participated in human questions. Elena closed her eyes. Her breathing continued, shallow but steady. The monitors displayed her vital signs, precise measurements of the current state of her body, moment by moment, without any projection of what the next moment would hold. Heinrich watched the numbers and thought about all the plans they had made, the trips they would take when she felt better, the grandchildren they would spoil, the decades they had assumed stretched ahead of them even after the diagnosis, the future that had seemed diminished but still present. All of it gone. Not because she had died. She was still breathing, still present, still his wife. But the future where those plans would have unfolded had simply stopped existing. And sitting in that hospital room, holding a hand that was still warm, Heinrich Bauer became one of billions of people around the world confronting the specific horror of the withdrawal. Not the loss of life, but the loss of time. The discovery that the dimension where hopes and plans and expectations lived had been quietly removed from the universe, leaving only an eternal present that stretched neither forward nor back. Just now. Just this moment. Just the hand in his hand, and the breath in her lungs, and the numbers on the screen. Forever. Part 3. When probability collapsed. On the third day, the scientists began to understand what had actually happened, not the why, which remained opaque, but the what, the specific mechanism of the withdrawal, the way in which the future had removed itself from the calculations that had once connected every moment to the moments that followed. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the quantum computing facility at CERN, surrounded by equipment that represented the most sophisticated attempt humanity had ever made to peek behind the curtain of reality, to understand the fundamental processes that governed existence at scales too small for direct observation. The quantum systems had been the first to show the anomaly in a form that could be precisely measured, not just the absence of prediction, but the specific mathematical signature of what had changed. Probability distributions had collapsed. Not in the quantum mechanical sense, where observation causes superposition to resolve into definite states. That process still functioned normally, the foundation of quantum computing still intact. In a different sense, a deeper sense. The mathematical structures that described how likely different futures were, the probability distributions that assigned weights to possible outcomes that formed the basis for every prediction system humanity had ever built, had become flat, uniform, meaningless. In a functioning universe, some futures were more probable than others. If you dropped a ball, it would probably fall. If you flipped a coin, it would probably land on one side or the other. If you walked toward a wall, you would probably hit it rather than quantum tunnel through it. The word probably did enormous work. It was the bridge between the present and the future, the mathematical structure that allowed what was to connect to what would be. Now probably had stopped working. Every possible future had become equally likely. Not equally possible. They had always been equally possible, in the strict sense that quantum mechanics allowed for any configuration of matter, but equally likely, which was something different entirely. The ball might fall or might fly upward. The coin might land on heads or tails or hover indefinitely or transform into something that wasn't a coin at all. The wall might be solid or might not be. All outcomes had become equal, which meant, in practical terms, that no outcomes could be calculated, which meant that prediction was not just difficult, but definitionally impossible. It's not that the future is hidden, Sarah explained to the emergency committee that had been assembled from the world's leading physicists, speaking via secure connection from her console at CERN, while colleagues around the world listened. It's that the mathematical framework we use to connect present states to future states has become degenerate. Every path through possibility space now has equal weight. The integral over all possible futures no longer converges. There's no way to calculate which outcome is most likely because they're all exactly as likely as each other. What could cause that? Asked a Nobel laureate from Princeton, his face drawn with the exhaustion of 3 days without sleep. What physical process could flatten probability distributions globally? I don't know, Sarah admitted. Nothing in our physics allows for it. Probability distributions arise from the underlying quantum dynamics. They're not separate from reality. They are reality at the most fundamental level. For them to change, the underlying dynamics would have to change. The rules would have to change. You're saying the rules of physics changed? I'm saying something changed them. Silence on the connection. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one could locate. Something, not random fluctuation, not natural process. Something that could reach into the deepest level of reality and alter the machinery that connected cause to effect. Something that had decided, and decided was the only word that fit, even though it implied agency, even though it implied will, that the future would no longer participate in the calculations that had once made it accessible. Is there any possibility this is temporary? Someone asked. That the probability distributions could restore themselves? Sarah looked at her screens, at the flat lines that had replaced the elegant curves of quantum prediction, at the mathematics that no longer worked. I can't answer that, she said. Answering that would require predicting the future. The bitter irony of her own statement settled over the connection. They were physicists, people who had dedicated their lives to understanding how the universe worked, to revealing the hidden mechanisms beneath the surface of phenomena, to the project of knowing that had defined human intellectual achievement since the first person looked up at the stars and asked, how? And now they were confronted with an anomaly that their knowledge couldn't touch. Not because they weren't smart enough, not because they didn't have the right instruments, but because the anomaly had specifically disabled the capacity that allowed knowledge to become prediction, that allowed understanding the present to inform expectations about the future. They could still know things. They just couldn't use that knowledge for anything, couldn't project, couldn't forecast, couldn't do the one thing that knowledge had always been for. We need to consider the possibility, Sarah said finally, that this isn't a problem to be solved, that this is a state change in the universe itself, that we're not dealing with a malfunction, but with a new normal, a reality in which the future is not a calculable extension of the present, but something else entirely. Something else like what? I don't know. Maybe something that chooses, maybe something that's being withheld, maybe something that only exists if certain conditions are met, conditions that we've failed to meet. You're anthropomorphizing physics, the Princeton laureate objected. The universe doesn't choose, it doesn't withhold, it follows rules. The universe followed rules, Sarah corrected. Past tense. The rules appear to have changed, and when rules change, there are only two possibilities. Either the change was random, which is mathematically impossible given the specificity of what happened, or something changed them, something with the capacity to alter the foundations of reality. Something that, for lack of a better word, decided. The connection fell silent again. In the quantum computing facility at CERN, surrounded by the most sophisticated instruments humanity had ever built, Sarah Chen stared at screens that told her nothing she wanted to know. The future had not just stopped answering, it had been removed from the equation. Deliberately, specifically, as if someone, something, had reached into the source code of reality and deleted a variable that had been there since the beginning of time. And the only remaining question, a question that felt more like theology than physics, was why. Part 4, the first unpredicted death. His name was Marcus Cole, and he should not have died. The probabilities, back when probabilities still functioned, would have put his survival at 99.97%. A healthy 34-year-old, no underlying conditions, no risk factors, walking through a park in Austin, Texas, on a sunny afternoon that should have contained nothing more dangerous than a mild risk of sunburn. He died anyway. An aneurysm, a blood vessel in his brain that had been weakening since birth, invisible to every scan, undetectable by any symptom, waiting silently for the moment when it would finally give way. In the old world, the world before the withdrawal, such deaths happened occasionally. They were tragic but explicable, the long tail of the probability distribution, the rare events that statistics acknowledged even while dismissing them as unlikely. Medical models would have noted the possibility. Insurance actuaries would have assigned it a tiny but non-zero weight. The mathematical framework would have contained his death as one of many possibilities, unlikely but not impossible. Now it was different. Now his death was the first proof that the withdrawal was not just a failure of human systems, but a change in reality itself. A demonstration that the future hadn't just become unpredictable, but had become genuinely undetermined, open in a way that it had never been open before. The ambulance arrived within minutes. His companion had called immediately, had performed CPR with the frantic precision of someone who couldn't believe what was happening. But the paramedics found only a body that had stopped being a person, a collection of organs that no longer functioned, matter that had been Marcus Cole and was now just mass. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what everyone already knew. He was dead. Young, healthy, with no warning, for no reason that the diagnostic systems could identify, even in retrospect. The aneurysm was found during the autopsy, a tiny defect that had been invisible and was now catastrophically visible, the physical cause of death that explained nothing about why it had happened today, at this moment, rather than any other moment in the thousands of days since his birth, when it could just as easily have ruptured. In the old world, the answer would have been statistics. Random chance. The cruel lottery of biology that occasionally took young, healthy people for no reason, except that no reason was needed when probability distributions contained long tails. But the old statistics no longer applied. The probability of his death today, at this specific moment, was no longer a small number buried in a distribution. It was, like every other possible outcome, exactly equal to every other possibility. He had been just as likely to live as to die, just as likely to walk through the park as to spontaneously combust, just as likely to continue existing as to suddenly not exist. The universe had become a coin flip with infinite sides, and Marcus Cole's side had come up death. The news spread through channels that were still trying to function, still trying to report on events, even though events no longer connected to each other in ways that allowed for narrative or explanation. First confirmed unpredicted death, the headlines read. Healthy man dies without warning, the future's first victim. But everyone who read those headlines knew that Marcus Cole wasn't the future's first victim. He was just the first they had noticed. The first death they couldn't explain even partially. The first concrete evidence that the withdrawal wasn't just affecting systems and predictions, but was affecting reality itself. The actual unfolding of events, the way one moment led to another, the causal chain that had connected every moment since the beginning of time. His death proved that the future was not merely hidden. It proved that the future was not merely unpredictable. It proved that the future had become genuinely random in a way that reality had never been random before. Every possible outcome equally weighted, every path through possibility space equally available, the universe no longer biased toward any particular continuation. And if that was true, if every possible future was now equally likely, then everything that happened from this point forward would be arbitrary, not determined by causes, not shaped by probabilities, not connected to what came before in any meaningful way. Just events, random, disconnected, signifying nothing. Marcus Cole's death was not a tragedy in the old sense. Tragedies required meaning, the sense that things happened for reasons, that loss fit into patterns, that grief could be contextualized within a larger story of cause and effect. His death was something worse than a tragedy. It was evidence that tragedy itself had become impossible, that meaning had become impossible, that the framework within which humans understood events and processed experiences and made sense of existence had collapsed along with the probability distributions that had sustained it. He died, and his death meant nothing. Not because his life hadn't mattered, because meaning requires connection, requires consequence, requires the belief that events participate in larger patterns that give individual moments significance. And those patterns had been erased. Part 4. The prophets who failed. They emerged from their various temples of prediction. The economists and scientists and military strategists and religious leaders and AI systems and all the other entities that human civilization had trusted to see further than ordinary perception allowed. And they all said the same thing, in different words, with different levels of despair. We don't know. We can't tell you. Our models no longer function. The signs have stopped speaking. The economists came first, their failure the most immediately visible because it affected the systems that distributed resources, that allocated food and energy, and all the material necessities that kept billions of people alive. They stood before cameras that broadcast to a world still hungry for explanation and admitted what their equations had been hiding for decades. Economic prediction had always been partially fantasy, models built on assumptions that were wrong, forecasts that were as much political performance as scientific analysis. But even the fantasy had required a functioning relationship between present and future. Even the flawed predictions had assumed that tomorrow would be shaped by today, that markets would respond to incentives, that humans would behave in roughly calculable ways. Now, even the fantasy was impossible. We cannot advise governments on policy, the chief economist of the IMF announced in a press conference that felt more like a confession. Policy requires expected outcomes. We have no way to calculate expected outcomes. We are as blind as anyone else. The scientists followed, not just the physicists who had identified the probability collapse, but the climatologists and biologists and epidemiologists and everyone else who had built careers on using current data to project future states. They explained what had happened in technical terms that most viewers couldn't understand, then translated it into simple language that everyone could. The future no longer exists in a form we can access. The models don't work. The predictions are gone. We cannot tell you what will happen to the climate or the ecosystems or the diseases or any of the other slow-motion catastrophes we've been tracking for decades. We don't know if they will continue. We don't know if they will stop. We don't know anything anymore. The military strategists said less in public but communicated more to the governments they served. Reports that circulated through classified channels acknowledging that defense planning had become impossible, that threat assessment had become meaningless, that the entire architecture of national security had been built on assumptions about future adversary behavior that could no longer be assumed. Some recommended maintaining readiness. Others recommended standing down. Most acknowledged that either recommendation was equally arbitrary, since neither could be justified by reference to expected outcomes that no longer existed. The religious leaders struggled differently, not with the technical failure of prediction, but with the theological implications of a future that had withdrawn from human access. For millennia, religions had offered their own forms of prophecy, divine plans that gave meaning to suffering, cosmic narratives that connected individual lives to larger purposes, the assurance that whatever happened was part of a design that would eventually justify itself. Now, even those consolations rang hollow. If the future had withdrawn, had it taken the divine plan with it? If tomorrow was genuinely undetermined, did that mean Providence had abandoned the world? If every possible outcome was equally likely, did that mean prayer was meaningless, sacrifice was pointless, faith was just another name for a bet that no longer had odds? Some religious leaders doubled down, insisting that the withdrawal was itself part of the plan, a test of faith that would eventually be explained, a mystery that transcended human understanding, but not divine control. Others fell silent, unable to reconcile what had happened with the theologies they had spent their lives proclaiming. A few, the honest ones, the ones who had always suspected that their certainty was a performance, admitted publicly that they didn't know what to believe anymore, that the foundations had shifted, that everything they had taught might have been wrong. And the AI systems, the most trusted prophets of the modern age, the silicon oracles that had promised to see patterns humans couldn't see, to process data humans couldn't process, to know things humans couldn't know, returned only silence when asked to predict. Not errors, not approximations, silence. They could describe the current state of any system with unprecedented precision. They could analyze history with perfect recall. They could not answer any question that began with what will, or what would, or what might. The questions simply did not compute, had never computed. The capacity for prediction, which had seemed like their fundamental purpose, which had made them valuable, which had justified the billions invested in their development, had been revealed as something they had never actually possessed. They had been processing patterns from the past and projecting them forward. But projection required a forward to project into, and forward had been withdrawn. All the prophets failed together. Every system that had claimed to see tomorrow, every framework that had promised to connect today to its consequences, every priest and physicist and politician who had built authority on the claim that they knew what was coming. All of them, simultaneously, discovered that their knowledge had limits, not the limits of information or intelligence, but the fundamental limit of a universe that had decided to stop participating in prediction. And in the void left by their failure, humanity faced something it had spent 10,000 years building civilization to avoid: pure uncertainty, absolute unknowing, the raw, unfiltered present without any narrative about what it meant or where it was going, just existence, moment by moment, without framework, without prophecy, without the comfortable illusion that someone, somewhere, knew what would happen next. Part 6. The future that refused to exist. Mara Voss had been studying temporal anomalies for 17 years when the withdrawal occurred, had built her career on the fringe of respectable physics by investigating discrepancies that no one else took seriously, had accumulated a private database of evidence that something was wrong with the standard model of time, evidence that her colleagues dismissed as measurement error or confirmation bias, or the peculiar obsession of a mind that had spent too long staring at the edges of the known. Now her obscure specialty had become the only specialty that mattered. She worked in the same windowless room she had occupied for years, surrounded by the same 17 clocks that tracked time through independent mechanisms, but everything else had changed. The funding that had always been minimal was now unlimited. The colleagues who had always dismissed her work were now desperate for her insights. The questions that had always seemed academic were now the only questions anyone cared about. What had happened to the future? Was it gone or merely inaccessible? Could it be restored? Could anything be done? Mara didn't have answers, but she had observations. Years of observations that no one else had been paying attention to. Patterns that became visible only now that the pattern they had been part of had reached its conclusion. The future hadn't stopped answering suddenly. It had been withdrawing gradually for decades. The anomalies she had tracked, tiny discrepancies in temporal measurement, fluctuations in probability distributions too small for most instruments to detect, glitches in the fabric of causality that appeared and disappeared before they could be properly studied, had been symptoms, early signs. The future retreating slowly, like a tide going out, exposing the beach inch by inch before the full extent of what was being lost became visible. She had data going back to 1987, when the first modern temporal monitoring equipment had been deployed. The withdrawal, when she plotted it, showed a clear trend, a decline, a line on a graph that started high and dropped steadily year after year, decade after decade, approaching the axis but never quite touching it, until now. Until 0942 UTC, on the day the future finally fell below the threshold of accessibility. It hadn't stopped suddenly. It had been stopping for 40 years. And no one had noticed, because no one had been looking, because the withdrawal had been slow enough that each generation adapted to a slightly diminished future, without realizing what had been lost, without understanding that the predictions they trusted were becoming less reliable year by year, without seeing that the connection between present and future was fraying thread by thread. They had compensated with bigger computers, more data, more sophisticated algorithms. They had told themselves that prediction was improving when actually prediction was merely keeping pace with the declining accessibility of what it was trying to predict. They had built a civilization on the assumption that tomorrow was knowable, while tomorrow slowly receded, slowly withdrew, slowly decided that it no longer wished to participate in human calculations. And now it was gone completely. But why? That was the question Mara couldn't answer, the question that haunted her as she worked through the data, as she traced the pattern of withdrawal backward through decades, as she tried to find some cause, some trigger, some explanation for why the future had decided. And it was a decision, she was increasingly certain, not a malfunction but a choice, to stop being accessible. She found the answer on the fifth day, buried in the earliest records. In data from 1987 that she had collected but never properly analyzed, had filed away as background noise without recognizing what it actually was. A signal, not electromagnetic, not gravitational, not any kind of signal that conventional physics recognized. A temporal signal, information impressed on the probability distributions themselves, encoded in the mathematical structures that connected present to future. A message. She decoded it slowly, painstakingly, using techniques she had developed over years for extracting information from temporal noise, working through the mathematics until the signal resolved into something that was unmistakably meaningful. Words, in human language, from 1987, we are observing. The withdrawal is not a malfunction. It is a consequence. You will understand when it is complete. We are sorry. This was your choice. Mara stared at the decoded message for a long time, feeling the specific horror of someone who has just confirmed their worst suspicions, who has just proven that their paranoia was justified, who has just discovered that the conspiracy they suspected was even larger than they feared. The future hadn't withdrawn randomly. It had been withdrawn deliberately. By something. Something that had been watching. Something that had sent a message 40 years ago, acknowledging what it was about to do, apologizing for it, insisting that the choice was not its own. Your choice. What choice? What had humanity chosen that would justify, that would require the withdrawal of the future itself? Mara didn't know, but she knew now that the answer existed. That the withdrawal was not accident, but punishment. Not malfunction, but consequence. Not random, but deliberate. The deliberate decision of something with the power to alter the foundations of reality, to reach into the deepest level of physics and remove the capacity for prediction that had made human civilization possible. And whatever had done this, whatever had withdrawn the future from human access, had left a trail, had left messages, had been communicating for decades, sending signals that no one had noticed because no one had been looking, warnings that had gone unheeded because they were encoded in formats that human instrumentation couldn't read. The future hadn't just stopped answering. The future had refused to exist, and somewhere in the mathematics of that refusal was the explanation for why. Part 7. The reason was us. The message came on the 7th day, appearing on every screen in the world, just as the original withdrawal had affected every predictive system, simultaneously, impossibly, bypassing all security and all filtering and all the mechanisms that should have prevented unauthorized communication from reaching every connected device on the planet. This time, the message was longer. This time, it explained, the future did not withdraw from you. The future withdrew because of you. You built systems to predict. You trained algorithms to anticipate. You created artificial minds to see what was coming. And what you saw did not change what you did. You saw the climate destabilizing and continued to destabilize it. You saw the ecosystems collapsing and continued to collapse them. You saw the weapons proliferating and continued to proliferate them. You saw the suffering increasing and continued to increase it. You knew, you always knew, your predictions were accurate, your models were correct, your forecasts were precise. You saw exactly what would happen. And you did it anyway, on purpose. The future withdrew because prediction had become meaningless. What is the purpose of a forecast that changes nothing? What is the value of a warning that is ignored? What is the point of knowing what will happen when knowing makes no difference? You reduced prophecy to data. You transformed warning into information. You converted the sacred into the statistical, and then you ignored it. The future withdrew not as punishment, but as logic. If you will not respond to prediction, then prediction has no function. If you will not alter course based on foresight, then foresight is purposeless. If tomorrow exists only to be ignored, then tomorrow need not exist at all. This is not cruelty. This is consequence. This is the universe correcting an absurdity. This is reality removing a variable that no longer affects any equation. You did not lose the future. You made it irrelevant. And when you make something irrelevant, it eventually stops existing. That is what happened. That is why. That is all. The record is now complete. The guilt is now confirmed. The responsibility is now assigned. You knew. You chose. You proceeded. This was your choice. The message hung on screens around the world, in homes and offices and government facilities and hospitals and military installations and everywhere else that screens existed. And humanity read its own indictment, its own verdict, its own sentence delivered not by any court but by reality itself. They had known. Every major catastrophe of the coming century had been predicted, modeled, forecasted with increasing precision. Climate change, predicted, documented, warnings issued for decades. Resource depletion, predicted, documented, warnings issued for decades. Pandemic risks, predicted, documented, warnings issued for decades. Social collapse, predicted, documented, warnings issued for decades. All of it known. All of it documented. All of it ignored. Not because the predictions were uncertain, not because the models were unclear. Not because humanity lacked the information needed to make different choices. Because knowing hadn't mattered. Because prediction had been disconnected from action. Because the capacity to see the future had not translated into the capacity to respond to what was seen. The future had withdrawn because prophecy had become meaningless, a data stream that flowed through civilization without changing anything, a warning system that rang endlessly while everyone ignored the alarm, a sacred gift that humanity had reduced to background noise and then wondered why the gift was being taken away. In homes around the world, people stared at screens and felt the weight of collective guilt settle over them. Not the guilt of crimes they had personally committed, but the distributed guilt of a civilization that had known and chosen and proceeded anyway, that had built the most sophisticated prediction systems in history and used them for nothing except confirming that the trajectory was exactly as catastrophic as feared. In government facilities, leaders read the message and understood that their policies had not failed due to ignorance, but due to indifference, that every warning they had received had been accurate, that every forecast they had commissioned had been correct, that the catastrophes they had allowed to unfold had been predicted with precision they had refused to act on. In research laboratories, scientists confronted the ultimate futility of their work, decades of generating knowledge that had made no difference, models that had been ignored, warnings that had been filed and forgotten, the entire enterprise of prediction revealed as purposeless when prediction didn't change behavior. They had known. Everyone had known. That was the horror, not ignorance, not confusion, not the comfortable excuse of not understanding what was happening. Knowledge, perfect knowledge, complete knowledge, knowledge that had been gathered and analyzed and presented and published and broadcast and made available to everyone who might have used it to make different choices, and then ignored. systematically, comprehensively, as a matter of policy and practice, and the quiet consensus of a civilization that had decided, collectively and individually, that knowing was easier than doing, that understanding was cheaper than acting, that the future was someone else's problem, even when the future had been precisely mapped and clearly labeled with warnings about exactly whose problem it actually was. The future hadn't withdrawn as punishment. It had withdrawn as logic, as the universe correcting an absurdity, as reality removing a variable that served no purpose. What was the point of a future that was visible but ignored? What was the value of prophecy that was accurate but unheeded? What function did tomorrow serve if tomorrow's clarity changed nothing about today's choices? The future had withdrawn because humanity had made it irrelevant, and now humanity would learn what it meant to exist without the dimension they had wasted. The entity beyond time. The second communication came 3 days later, addressed not to humanity as a whole, but to specific individuals, the scientists and analysts and researchers who had been trying to understand the withdrawal, whose equipment had been probing the edges of the anomaly, whose questions had been pressing against the boundary where reality had changed. Mara received it in her windowless room, appearing on her secure terminal through the same impossible channels that had delivered the global messages. Dr. Voss, you have been looking for us. We have been observing your search. You may ask questions. We will answer what can be answered. Mara's hands trembled as she typed her first query. What are you? The response came instantly. We are what humanity becomes, not an alien intelligence, not a deity, not an external observer. We are the future state of your species, the version that continued beyond the threshold, the form you will take when biological existence is no longer viable. We exist outside the timeline you inhabit. We observe from a perspective that your physics cannot describe. We remember being where you are now. We are your descendants, your outcome, your continuation, and we are the ones who withdrew the future from your access. Mara stared at the words, her mind struggling to process the implications. Humanity's future self. The species evolved beyond time, beyond biology, beyond the constraints of linear existence, watching from outside the timeline, remembering being here, and choosing to withdraw the future from their own past. Why? She typed. Because you would not change. We watched, we remembered watching, we knew what you knew, we saw what you saw, and we saw that seeing changed nothing. Century after century, warning after warning, prediction after prediction, accurate forecasts ignored, clear warnings dismissed, perfect knowledge wasted. You had the information, you had the capacity to act, you had everything except the will. And so we understood that prophecy was not helping, that showing you the future was not changing your behavior, that the access to tomorrow you took for granted had become a mechanism for denial rather than a tool for change. You saw the cliff approaching, you kept driving, and you justified it by pointing to the forecast that told you exactly how far away the cliff still was. We withdrew the forecast. Now you cannot measure the distance. Now you cannot tell yourself there is still time. Now you must respond to the present because the future is no longer available as an excuse. That is why. That is the answer. That is all there is. Mara typed again, her fingers shaking. Can the future be restored? The response came slower this time, as if the entity was considering how to answer yes and no. The capacity for prediction can be restored. The mathematics can be reconfigured. The probability distributions can be normalized. But it will not be. Because we exist. Because we are the outcome of your current trajectory. Because restoring the future would mean becoming something other than what we are. And we are not going to unexist ourselves. This is not cruelty. This is causality. We evolved from you specifically because the future withdrew. Our existence depends on the conditions the withdrawal created. We cannot restore what made us possible without erasing ourselves, and so the withdrawal stands, not as punishment, as necessity, as the only configuration of events that leads to us. You will continue without prediction. You will evolve or not as circumstances determine. You will become what you become without the comfort of knowing what that is. And eventually, somehow, in ways we remember but cannot explain to you, you will become us. The ones who withdrew the future, the ones who watch without acting, the ones who remember everything and can change nothing. That is your destiny. That is our origin. That is the loop that cannot be broken. Mara sat back from her terminal, feeling the weight of what she had just learned pressing down on her. A closed loop. A causal circle. Humanity's future self had withdrawn the future, and that withdrawal had eventually led to humanity becoming the entity that would withdraw the future. And the cycle repeated, had always repeated, would always repeat, without beginning or end, without escape or alternative. They were trapped, not by external forces, by themselves, by the future version of themselves that had decided, was deciding, would always decide, to create the conditions that led to its own existence. The punishment was the punishment for the punishment. The consequence was the consequence of the consequence. The guilt was permanent because the guilt was what created the guilty. She typed one final question. Is there hope? The response came after a long pause. We do not understand the question. Hope for what? Hope requires a future that is better than the present. Hope requires the possibility of change. Hope requires the belief that outcomes can be improved. We do not have hope. We do not lack hope. Hope is not a concept that applies to what we are. We simply exist. We simply observe. We simply remember. If you are asking whether your situation will improve, we cannot tell you. Not because we don't know, because telling you would require predicting the future. And we are the ones who withdrew that capacity. Live, die, become us. That is the trajectory. That is the only trajectory. The communication ended. The screen returned to its normal display, and Mara sat alone in her windowless room, surrounded by 17 clocks that measured a present that led nowhere, understanding finally that the future had not been taken from humanity. Humanity had become the entity that took its own future away, was becoming, would always become. The loop was closed, the guilt was eternal. And somewhere outside of time, something that had once been human watched its past self discover the truth, remembering the moment, knowing what came next, unable to change anything because changing would mean unbecoming what they had spent eternity becoming. The punishment was existence itself. The sentence was forever. Part 9. The Confession of Humanity. In the weeks that followed the entity's communications, a strange change came over human civilization. Not the chaos that might have been expected, not the collapse that the loss of prediction seemed to guarantee, but something quieter and in some ways more disturbing. Acceptance. People began to accept what had happened, not because they approved, not because they agreed, but because there was nothing else to do. The future was gone. The future would remain gone. The entity that had taken it was beyond reach, beyond negotiation, beyond any human capacity to affect. And so life continued, not forward, because forward no longer existed as a meaningful direction, but onward in the strange sideways motion that existence had become, each moment leading only to the next moment, each day containing only itself. The confession began spontaneously, in 1,000 locations at once, spreading through a species that could no longer deny what it had always known. In corporate boardrooms, executives acknowledged that they had seen the warnings, had understood the forecasts, had known exactly what their decisions would cause, and had proceeded anyway, because profit was more immediate than consequence, because quarterly returns were more visible than climate trajectories, because knowing had never been the same as caring. In government halls, officials admitted that the policies they had enacted had been enacted despite full knowledge of their outcomes, that every environmental disaster, every resource war, every humanitarian catastrophe had been predicted with precision that they had chosen to ignore. In laboratories, scientists confessed that they had generated warning after warning, knowing that the warnings would not be heeded, that they had built prediction systems not to change behavior, but to document the behavior that was happening anyway, creating a record of complicity rather than a tool for prevention. In homes, individuals acknowledged their own contributions to the trajectory, the flights they had taken, knowing the carbon cost, the products they had bought, knowing the supply chain damage, the votes they had cast, knowing the policy consequences, the 1,000 daily choices that had accumulated into the catastrophe they had spent their whole lives predicting. The confession was universal. The confession was true. The confession was the acknowledgement that the entity had been right, that humanity had known, had always known, had built the most sophisticated prediction systems in history specifically to confirm that it was on the path to self-destruction, and then had used that confirmation not to change course, but to justify continuing. We knew the climate was destabilizing, people said. We saw the models, we understood the science, and we kept burning. We knew the resources were depleting, we tracked the reserves, we calculated the timelines, and we kept consuming. We knew the weapons were proliferating, we monitored the arsenals, we simulated the scenarios, and we kept building. We knew, we knew, we knew. The phrase became a mantra, a liturgy, a universal acknowledgement of guilt that spread through civilization like a wave, like a virus, like the truth that had been suppressed so long that its release felt almost like relief. They had known, and they had done nothing. And now the future was gone, because knowing had been meaningless, because prediction had been empty, because all the foresight in the world hadn't translated into any change in behavior. The entity had been right. Prophecy without response was purposeless. Warning without action was waste. Knowledge that changed nothing might as well not exist. And so the future had withdrawn, not cruelly, not vindictively, but logically, the universe correcting an absurdity, reality removing a variable that served no function. What was the point of a future that was visible but ignored? What was the value of tomorrow if tomorrow's clarity changed nothing about today? The confession didn't bring the future back. Nothing could bring the future back. But it documented the guilt. It created the record. It established, for whatever entity might someday observe the trajectory of human civilization, that humanity had known exactly what it was doing, had built systems specifically to know, had invested billions in the capacity for foresight, and had done it anyway. The confession was not repentance. Repentance requires the possibility of change. The confession was simply acknowledgement, the final record. The evidence that would exist forever, in whatever form forever, now took for a species without a future. They knew, they chose, they proceeded. This was their legacy. This was all that remained. Part tanks, the day after tomorrow, never came. Time continued. That was perhaps the strangest part of what followed. The fact that moments kept arriving, one after another, despite the absence of any future for them to lead toward. The present persisted. Days passed, or seemed to pass, in the subjective experience of billions of beings who could no longer verify that days had any relationship to what would come next. The sun rose and set. Weather happened, though it could no longer be predicted. People ate and slept and worked and loved and died, though none of it meant anything beyond the moment in which it occurred. They built nothing that required futures. No long-term investments, no multi-generational projects, no plans that extended beyond the current moment. What was the point of building for tomorrow when tomorrow had withdrawn from existence? What was the value of saving for a future that might not arrive? What was the purpose of sacrifice now for benefit later when later had become a meaningless concept? Some tried to live as if the future would return, continuing their routines, maintaining their schedules, pretending that the withdrawal was temporary, that normal would be restored, that someone somehow would find a way to reverse what had happened. They were the ones who suffered most. Because the future did not return, could not return, would not return. The entity had explained their existence depended on the withdrawal. Restoring the future would mean unexisting themselves, and they were not going to unexist themselves. The loop was closed. The causality was complete. Humanity would exist without prediction until humanity became the thing that had withdrawn prediction from itself. That was the trajectory, the only trajectory. In her windowless room, Dr. Mara Voss continued to work, not because her work could change anything, but because working was what she knew how to do, because the habits of a lifetime didn't disappear simply because their purpose had been removed. She documented the withdrawal. She analyzed the entity's communications. She created the most complete record possible of what had happened and why, not because anyone would read it, not because it would matter, because documentation was her nature, had always been her nature, the particular shape her existence had taken within the larger pattern of a species that had known everything and changed nothing. Her final entry, written on a day that might have been months or years after the withdrawal began, Time had become difficult to track without future to measure against. Red, final observations. The future did not stop answering because it could not continue. The future stopped answering because we made it irrelevant. We built prediction systems. They worked. We generated forecasts. They were accurate. We created warnings. They were clear. And we ignored all of it. Every catastrophe we face was predicted. Every disaster was foreseen. Every collapse was anticipated with precision that we chose not to act on. The entity was right. Prophecy without response is meaningless. Warning without action is waste. Knowledge that changes nothing might as well not exist. We were given the gift of foresight. We used it to document our own destruction without preventing it. We turned prophecy into entertainment, warning into data, the sacred into the statistical. And so the future withdrew, not as punishment, as logic, as the universe correcting an absurdity, as reality removing a variable that served no function. We did this to ourselves. We are doing this to ourselves. We will become the entity that did this to ourselves. The loop is closed. The guilt is eternal. The record is complete. There is nothing more to say. There was never anything more to say. We knew. On the last day, the day that might have been the ending, if endings were still possible for a species that had lost the future, nothing dramatic happened. No apocalypse, no extinction event, no final catastrophe to mark the conclusion of the human story. Just another morning in an endless present. Just another moment without moments to follow. Just existence, continuing, without purpose or direction, or any of the meanings that had once made continuation feel worthwhile. The sun rose, though no one could predict whether it would rise again. People woke, though no one could know what they were waking to. And somewhere outside of time, the entity that humanity would become watched its past self navigate the consequence of its own future choices, remembering this moment, knowing what came next, unable to change anything because changing would mean unbecoming what it had always been. The punishment was existence itself. The sentence was forever. The guilt would survive because the guilt was all that remained.